business. So we've got Hannah Driver here. She's a senior accountant and product manager at Scribe. She's been working with us for, you had your 5-year anniversary this year, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Well, we got you a present, didn't we?
You did indeed, yeah. After a bit of prompting, you did.
Yeah, I actually forgot. So got her a voucher for some running shoes.
You did, yeah.
Hannah likes to run.
Yeah.
So Hannah is a qualified accountant, but she's also super experienced in dealing with parish and town councils, all kinds of sizes, the most teeny one, also the largest one. So what she doesn't know about accounts is not worth knowing. You can test her at the end with some questions. So over to you, Hannah.
Lovely, thank you. So really useful as well to see the poll as well, because lots about that on forecasting, which is a big sort of part of the section today. So that's really, really great. Let me share my screen and then we can get started. Lovely. So there we are. So firstly, just to say, I recognise quite a lot of faces and names on here, which is lovely. So if you use Scribe, that's absolutely fab. But just to say that today's session is more of a general session. It's not particularly Scribe focused. We do have separate Scribe sessions about how to do this forecasting and adding budgets into Scribe. So if you want to look out for that, do feel free to do so. Today is just more of a general overview of the process to hopefully help with some of those things in the poll. I noticed there's a bit of lack of confidence as well. So it's nice just to have this as a bit of a refresher. Obviously, when you do it once a year, it can be quite daunting because it is so important. You're setting that precept is so significant and so important because obviously you're asking people for their money to put into your council. So it's really important to get it right. Okay, so let's get started then, thinking about firstly, what is budgeting? So it sounds quite basic, but just important just to understand that it's that financial plan for a specific period of time, often a year. And in this scenario, of course, we are talking about a financial year as well. If you've never budgeted, you think, oh my goodness, I've got no idea what I'm doing. I don't like accounts, money, numbers, etc., then it's important to think that you probably do budget reasonably regularly, even if it's just at home, just managing those books, the money, I need to pay the mortgage, the rent, the electricity, can I afford to go on holiday, go out for dinner, whatever it may be. It's just thinking about what money have I got coming in, what do I need to spend, what do I want to spend, and how can we marry that up? Okay, and it's just kind of a bigger basis here. So parish councils, regardless of their size, have a statutory duty to prepare that annual budget. So probably why you're all here today, because we've got to get that done. The budget must be prepared and approved before setting the precept, and that needs to happen before the start of the financial year as well. So really important element of the financial year, getting that done so we've got that precept set and we've got that budget in place ready to go from the 1st of April. I've also put at the bottom there, all members of the council should understand the budget. So that's something else that was in the poll and that some people felt was maybe a problem with council's understanding of the budget. Obviously, everybody will come from a different walk of life, and some people will be not really wanting to get involved in that budget, not particularly used or au fait with budgeting. You may have another end of the spectrum where you've got people coming in who are used to sort of commercial budgeting and very involved in sort of a financial element. That can also bring its own sort of challenges as well when you're trying to marry up sort of commercial element of a business and how a council works. So that can be tricky as well. But it's just important to involve everybody to at least, if so, the importance of the budget, even if the sort of intricacies of the numbers and the way some of that's been worked out is beyond, it's important to still understand the importance of having that budget and also monitoring it as well throughout the year. So primarily today we're thinking about the budget and therefore creating the precept, setting the precept for next year. But also as a theme of today, I really want to kind of stress how important it is to continually monitor that budget, think about the budget all the way through the year, compare it to the actuals month on month at your meetings and get involved in it, so it gives you a better understanding. So when you come to this point, you've got a better feel for what's happening with regards to the budget, and it's not a shock that something that you suddenly do once a year. Okay, so why is budgeting important? I kind of got into that a little bit from that point, but obviously primarily it's about the precept, okay, but also it allows you to plan for future projects, so you can start to think about what might we like to do within my parish, my area, and how does that work, how does that fit into the budget. And particularly as well, if we do monitor that budget on a regular basis. It's also going to help flag up potential under or overspend. So that's really key when we start to think about forecasting as well in a moment, how that can help us. But actually understanding and monitoring that budget then is not a shock at the end of the year when we suddenly tot up all the figures and we've not got as much in the bank account as we thought we were going to have. How do we deal with that? It starts to allow us to think about what we can maybe do differently to mitigate some of those issues if it looks like we're going to be overspent on the budget, or if we're going to have a large surplus, we can start to think about how we want to plough that back into different projects or reserves going forward. So the budgeting timetable then, so this is reasonably rough in here, but just gives you a start to feel for when we need to be doing these things. Obviously we're in October now, and so we're starting to think about the draft budgets and putting some information in to get the information together to start to think about next year's draft, particularly if you've got different departments or committees within the council that you want to get to work on an element of the total budget that you then need to put together. So you obviously need to give them clear sort of deadlines to work to so that you can then bring that information together, with the view that November you might have your first full draft budget. December, then you might be having your full council meeting to present and sign off that budget. It may be relevant that you'll need to have prior reviews as well, particularly if your budget is changing significantly to your current budget, or the scope of the things, the services that you do have changed, and therefore it's not as straightforward maybe as it might have used to have been. If it's a simple sort of continuation of what you do, then make sure you build in the ability to review and think about what you're doing, particularly if you're pulling draft budgets together from different areas, to make sure that they marry up and that nothing's been missed or double counted as it comes together. And then January, working towards that precept being agreed and submitted to the billing authority. So just as a point there, to make sure you've got clear dates that you're working to, work back from that ultimate date so that you know when those things are going to happen. And if you've got other people or areas that you're relying on to give you information, just be clear on that deadline, because you don't want to be then pushed up against it to put all that information together. And it's another one of those juggling acts of having more to do and fitting that time in as well. So then thinking about budgeting approaches. Okay, so there's a couple I just want to talk about here. I don't want to get too bogged down in loads of sort of terminology, but I think it just helps to think about how am I going to go ahead and think about next year's budget. Okay, so the first one is incremental budgeting. It doesn't matter if you haven't heard of it, but basically it's a traditional method of budgeting based on the current year, possibly some historic data as well, and you simply add on a percentage or an incremental amount. So this is really good if your current budget is quite good, it's fit for purpose, it's got the breakdown and the structure that you like, that you want to use for your reporting and that your councillors understand. It's in line with things you do, you know, the services and the things that you provide are fairly consistent, and the budget versus actuals that you're looking at the moment look sort of fairly consistent. You're not having huge fluctuations in the budget values that you've got at the moment. If you've got a good basis, then you can use that going forward to simply maybe add on a percentage or incremental amount. At the bottom there, it does say it doesn't encourage an in-depth analysis of the current budget. So it could be that you could take your current budget and simply add on a percentage, say 3%, 5%, whatever it may be. You'd have a budget, but obviously you've not really thought about the detail and the individual lines and elements of that budget. So if you are going to use this, and I would imagine most of you are, because in most cases you're going to have a budget that you want to build on already, it's just thinking about those individual lines. There may be certain elements of the budget where you need to go back and revisit them, particularly if something's changed or you end the current year with a huge deficit or surplus. So it might flag up something's wrong in that particular area. But most of the time, you can use the current budget that we've got as a starting point to move forward. Okay. The other end of the spectrum is zero-based budgeting. So as it sounds, starts from scratch, you ignore everything that's gone before, that's all gone, blank piece of paper, you start again. So as it says there, it does allow for full analysis of all budget elements, because it's down to you to think of every single thing that you need to think about within that budget and build it back up again. Okay, so that's quite extreme. Okay, it's going to obviously take you longer, but there may be times when that might be relevant. So if you've particularly come into maybe new council and the budget just simply isn't fit for purpose. I think there was a couple of responses in the poll that said that was the case. So it might be that maybe the structure's bad. So there was a structure, but now maybe it hasn't been changed for a number of years, and what the council does or the scope has changed significantly. So now that doesn't really marry up with how you want to review the budget and the reports that you then want to produce. Or it might be that actually the individual budget figures just don't seem to marry up with anything. If you've got huge surpluses, huge deficits, it's really hard to compare actuals against those budgets because there just seems to be no relationship there. It might be a point at which you have to say, right, we need to start again, particularly if you're going to end up, or you expect to end up with a large surplus or a large deficit. Is it because the precept and the budget is just not correct? It's been based on something that's no longer appropriate. And if you continue in that vein, it's going to just make problems worse. Either you're going to have a huge surplus that you then got to think how you deal with that, or you end up with a massive deficit, and how do you then resolve that with having to put the precept up and the knock-on effects of those elements as well. So you may find yourself in that scenario. Also, though, it can just be useful for one-off or special projects as well. So your core budget might be good, but if something else has come into play, you're taken on another area that you need to look after, or maybe you've built a community centre or something, so you now need to think about that budget element. Obviously, if nothing like that's happened before, there's no precedent there, so you'd need to build it up, but it might be that it's just tagged onto your current budget. So it might be that you also use a combination of those two approaches. Okay then, so now I want to talk about forecasting, which I think from the poll was something that's really key here, and the importance that we shouldn't underestimate of how useful it is to have a forecast. So if we are thinking about wanting to compare our current budget, so the budget of this year that we're in now, what we want to do is ideally see what the end of year position is going to look like. We want our crystal ball to turn up at the 31st of March and say, right, what does this year look like against our budget? So we can then make informed decisions about next year's budget based on areas we're overspent that might need tweaking and how it all affects it. Obviously, though, we've got the problem that we've got 6 months to the end of the year, and at the moment we've only got actuals for the first half of the year. Therefore, we can forecast, so predict the future income and expenditure to create that end of year position, because then that helps us give a picture of what do we think this year is going to look like. Okay, you might create that forecast. You can still use it in conjunction with other data. So I've got there, especially if the current year is non-typical. So this was, if you think a few years ago, obviously we were talking about this in the time of COVID, and we had a year that was completely not typical because the things were shut and things didn't happen in the same way. So it might be relevant to go back and look at previous years. And that might be true for some of you as well. If something's gone on in the council that's not necessarily in line with what normally happens and you need to start thinking ahead, you might need to bring in other elements of data to help you to think about it as well. Today then we're thinking about forecasting primarily to help us get that end of year expected position to compare to our current year budget to help us inform us about next year's budget. But I also want to say how useful it can be as well to help you to manage the spending. So if you go away now and create your forecast for this year, you'll obviously have your expected end of year position. Okay, if that looks like then that you're going to be hugely overspent, or maybe you're going to be hugely underspent, that then starts to flag up scenarios that you need to consider. So as part of your monthly meetings of the remaining months of this year, you can report on what do we think is going to happen, and therefore do we need to do something about it. If it looks like we're going to be in a budget deficit, do we need to defer some of our planned spending? Can we change the scope of some of the spending in the remaining months of the year? Do we need to think about our reserves and our ability to draw down on them to cover us for that period? Is it going to have a knock-on effect as well as next year's budget if we're not going to have as much in the general reserve as we thought? So it's also really important to not only use it to think about next year, but also consider this year, particularly if it looks like you're going to have quite a significant variance to the current budget. Okay. So now we've kind of covered why it's so important and can be so helpful. We need to think, how do we forecast? Okay, so we're at a prime time now. Is it what we're 6th of October? Really good point to do this because we've got a position where we've got April to September as a 6 months. So our first half of the year, we've got our actuals on. So whatever cash book you're using, get that data in up to the end of September, reconcile it, bank reconciliation, you've got that half year point. Okay. And then you can predict the remaining month income and expenditure per budget line. A very simple basis. You could just take your first 6 months and double it, but generally I'd like you to go into more detail than that and think about the spend against each of those budget lines and what you expect to happen in the remaining months of the year. In the same way with budgeting and forecasting, some of the lines will be a lot easier, because if you've got phone bill, for example, and you know it's £30 a month, that's super simple. You can pop that in for the remaining months of the year. Salaries, if they're fairly static, lots of those lines you'll be able to predict and say exactly what's going to happen with those remaining months. Others will be harder, okay, but it's a prediction. It's your estimation of what you expect to happen. Okay, when you do this though, do remember to be realistic. Okay, so when you're forecasting, it's about what you expect to happen. So even if it ends up that a budget line looks like it's going to be overspent, make sure you put that information in, because then that's helpful looking at next year. Because if you're overspent on a budget line, do we therefore need to increase that budget line next year? Or was there a reason, a one-off expenditure, for example, that we don't need to consider? So it then starts to help us think about the questions that we need to ask and the elements that might affect our budget for next year as well. And then, of course, once you've got that forecast, you can analyse it against your current budget to see what it looks like. Okay. So this is quite helpful because it's a bit of a visual representation of basically what I've just been talking about. Okay, it's an extract from a spreadsheet I set up 4 or 5 years, probably at the start when I first started at Scribe, because at that point we didn't have such a sophisticated forecasting function on Scribe, which we do now have. So lots of our users wanted to be able to forecast. We didn't have that initially, but still people find that spreadsheet useful as well, and that's something that we can provide to you if you want it. But basically then, over on the left hand side, I've got my areas. So I've got my admin, my grants maintenance, my allotments. I've got my budget codes, my budget lines beneath that. Okay, this one primarily is based around payment budgets, but if you want to do the same for income, you can absolutely do that. So you can just fill in the structure that you've got for you. And then the budget column, that's the total annual budget for this year. So each of those lines, the total budget. I've got my actual column. So what have I spent against each of these budget lines for April to September? So at this point, where are we? And then forecast for October to March. So these are the months that as of yet I don't have actuals for, because obviously they haven't happened yet. So I'm going to go through, excuse me, and put in that information about what I expect to spend. As I said, some of it will be easier. Some of it might be a little bit harder, and I might have to use my best guess. I might want to base it on what's gone before, or just see what's happened, or maybe the trend of previous years as well. Okay. The examples in here are fairly small numbers, just to keep it simple, but you get a feel for what we're doing in here. Then we've got our total. So our total is our actual spend April to September, plus our forecast for October to March to give our total, so our expected end of year position. So based on our forecasted figures, what do we expect the end of the year to look like against each of these lines? Okay, that then gives us a variance to the budget. So if my forecast was correct, which of course it's not going to be, to the penny to the pound, but it gives us a feel for what we expect to happen against these budget lines. That then allows us to think about proposing our budget for next year. So against each of those lines, if we're going to be overspent, or we expect to be overspent this year, do we need to increase the budget? Can we keep the budget the same? Is there any factors that we need to be aware of? Okay, so we can start to fill that information in to build it up, get that draft to see what that might look like. Okay, you see on the final end as well, we've also got the ability just to add comments in there. And I want to also say how important it is to keep notes around the budget, potentially not only as you do this process, but all the time. So anything that you think might have an effect on your budget, maybe a cost for next year, you get a renewal in, what it's going to be, note that down. That's useful to have. Or something's going to change with regards to a service that you provide. Something's happened that's a one-off that you don't want to account for next year again. Note those things down, because then when you're going through that process, you've got all those things to refer to, and it's useful to record what you're doing as well. Okay, so I hope that's helpful, because it kind of gives you a bit of a visual idea of what we're trying to achieve in terms of a forecast, and then why that helps us thinking about next year as well. Okay, That one's just an example. So if you do have software that does it for you, such as Scribe, you can basically achieve the same thing, but plug the numbers into the software and it produces it for you. So also with regards to forecasting, once you've created that forecast for October to March, you can then keep using it. So as you go through months, you can update October for the actuals, tweak the forecasting as you go, and then that allows you to keep reporting month on month at what you expect is going to happen. And obviously you'll get more actuals building up, and you might get more of it. So it start to get more accurate as you get close to the end of the year as well. But it can be useful to then help you move forward. Okay. So now we've got our forecast, we can think about the actual budget process itself. Okay. So as it says then at the top, we're going to use our current year forecast. So assuming that we are wanting to think about incremental budgeting, i.e. basing it on historic data, that budget information that we've already got, and then other relevant data. So as I said, information that we have known costs of maybe our insurance renewal or subscription renewals, etc., and other relevant data. We've got that information, and then we need to consider the elements of our budget. So I've got in there expenditure firstly, because I think that's key to start with that, because that's the biggest element of a council budget. And sort of majority of the time, it's all about the expenditure that you've got going out. Then we're going to think about income. So income that your council might be getting that's other than the precept. And we also need to be mindful of contingencies and reserves. While we're working through that process, we just want to be mindful of our level of detail and our materiality. So that just means not getting too bogged down in the budget lines that are fairly insignificant. And if you've got a small stationery budget, you don't need to spend ages working out what you need, how many pens you're going to buy in June, etc. Whereas you might have some really large budget lines, and they're going to be the ones that we really need to pay attention to. So obviously things like getting your staff costs correct. But if you've got large budgets that are harder to predict, these are the ones that you need to take your time over to get worked on basic information that's got a basis to that, and also notes as well, as I said, really useful to have. So as we said then, start with expenditure, and it's just case of going through, as we said, working against that forecast. What do we think the budget needs to be for next year? We start with fixed costs, indirect costs or overheads. These are costs that are unlikely to change. So things like your staff costs, if you have your monthly salary, your phone bill, if that's just a fixed rate phone bill, they're fairly easy to budget for. You can go through nice equal 12 months. This is the cost. Some might even be known, as we said. You might already know what you need to pay for insurance. You might have some subscriptions that you already knew what those renewals are. These are going to be nice and straightforward to deal with initially. Others you might want to just apply a small percentage for a cost rise as well. But if they're fairly static and things are consistent, then they're easy to deal with. And generally, they tend to make up the majority of the expenditure items in the budget. Then you're going to also have your reactive or your variable costs. So these are going to be things that are harder to predict. So I've put there, for example, maintenance. So you might have a maintenance budget that might have an element of some planned maintenance. So you might go and do some servicing, or you might go and paint the fence of every summer, whatever it may be. So there may be a fixed element to it, but it might also include a reactive element. So if somebody phones up and says, this is broken, we need to maintain this, etc., and you have to go and repair it, then obviously those elements are harder to predict. Things like tree works, maybe, if you get a storm and trees blow down and then needs resolving, that's going to have an impact, but you can't necessarily predict exactly what's going to happen with regards to that. But you may have a level of maintenance that you always do around that as well. So it's thinking about what that makes up, and obviously just keep records and notes again, as I said, about what you're basing that on and how that maps out. And you might need to look back at previous years as well. With regards to things like maintenance, you might also want to consider the assets that maintenance relates to. How old is that asset? If you've just replaced it, then the maintenance cost is hopefully going to be fairly low, because if it's not under warranty, then hopefully it's not going to break. But if it's getting to the end of its useful life, does your maintenance budget needs to go up? Because obviously it's more prone to things going wrong. So it's thinking about relationships. There's quite a lot of relationships when you think about budget. What's the knock-on effect of this, and how does that affect another line? Okay. Same with my second point of there. So if you're thinking about maybe related to level activity. So if you do have a venue that you hire out, you might be hoping that next year you're going to be able to hire that venue out more than you have previously. You're going to promote it and more opportunities for hire. But if you want to put that into the budget and build that in, then you again need to think about those relationships. So if you're going to say we're going to have our venue open more often and hire it out more, is there then a knock-on effect about the other related costs? So are your utilities going to go up because you're going to have to heat the building and light it more often? Are you going to have increased cleaning costs? Are you going to need the caretaker to come in and unlock more often? So what is the relationship between those other elements to think about as well? As I said, it tends to be generally a smaller proportion of the overall budget items that you're thinking about, but these ones might be the ones that take more work and consideration, might need more discussion. You might need to go through a few drafts about getting those sort of levels right in that relationship and that consideration. Once you've done the expenditure, then you can think about income. So this is really about income other than the precept. So if you have a council that's mainly based on just the precept, you're not going to have much significant other income. You might have a bit of bank interest, a few bits of sundry income coming in, probably not enough to make particular impact on anything in here. But if you do have other areas of income, so you might have allotments, venues that you hire out, a cemetery, a car park, etc. Obviously, you need to give consideration to what income you're expecting to come in from that. Again, some of it might be fixed. So if you know you're going to get a specific grant and the value of that grant, then obviously you can put that in to the budget. If you have fixed income such as annual rent, if you hire out a property on an annual basis and you get that fixed amount of rent, then again, that's nice and simple. You can put that into the budget. But then, of course, you need to think about those other variables as well. So allotments are fairly standard. If you've got a number of plots and you know what the plot rate is, that's easy to calculate. But if you've got a venue or a car park, then potentially it's going to be harder to think about it. So as you review that, you just got to think about, is that likely to continue? So do you expect it to stand at the same level? So we're thinking about our venue. Do we want to try and increase the hire, as we talked about a moment ago? Also, are you changing the rates or the fees? So if you're obviously putting up your rates, if you're charging more for your allotments next year, make sure that you obviously factor all that in as you think about that process. And some of it, again, will have to be estimated. So things that are uncertain sources, such as the cemetery or your venue hire, that may be hard to quantify. There's some levels of estimation in there as well. Okay. Then we can move on and think about our contingencies on our reserves as well, because we've also got to be mindful about when we're thinking about the budget itself and the precept that we want, we also need to be maintaining our reserve and our general reserve. Okay. And we're thinking about how we're going to, if we are, and if so, how are we going to have contingencies in our budget as well? So our general reserve should be equal to 3 and 12 months expenditure, basically, depending on the size that you are. If you're very small, then you'll have more like 12 months. If you're larger, then it will be about 3 months, because the impact of something, if you're smaller, can obviously be greater if you've not got so much money in the bank. And you need to maintain it at an appropriate level. It might be that you have a specific amount that you maintain at your council. I've seen that before, that have a number that you're working with, or you might have that rough estimation of where you want to be. So this is where the forecast can then come into play, because if we forecast this year itself, then we start to get a feel of what the end of the year is going to look like, to say, well, are we going to still be maintaining our general reserve at that level? And if we're not, is that therefore going to have an effect on what we can do next year with regards to the precept? Can we offset some of it maybe? Or actually, if we're going to be in a deficit, how do we then mitigate that and what do we do about it? So it's thinking about that again, those relationships, and about how that works in. Also be mindful of contingency. So you want to have a level of things that, unexpected things can happen, and you want to guard against that potentially, but you don't want to be sort of a doom monger on every single line, because if you build in what ifs, a contingency on every single budget line, then you're going to end up with a budget far over and above what you need, because the likelihood of something happening against every single budget element is so incredibly small. Also, if you do put contingencies into each budget line, it's going to potentially mask anything that does happen. So it's better to have what you expect to spend against this budget. And then if you do go overspent because you've got a one-off item, you can very clearly see that relationship and why that's happened. You can also show it against an individual contingency line, so that you can see exactly, when you review that budget, these were the things that we spent. they were unexpected, they were one-off, they're not going to be repeated. We can see the impact on the budget, but we don't need to consider them for next year's budget because we don't see any reason why those things would happen again. Okay, so as I said, beware those one-off costs when you are reviewing the actual spend. Don't get caught up in if you've put it in to a line and think, oh, I need to increase my budget for next year because we're significantly overspent. But if actually it was a one-off that caused that problem, then obviously the budget for next year doesn't necessarily need to rise. Okay, so again, it's thinking about those relationships and the impact and understanding what things have gone into the budget itself. And in terms of reserves and projects, then you might want to also think about what you want to do and how you plan ahead for certain things as well, and how that might impact in the budget. Do you want to build some money into the budget that you're then going to put into your earmarked reserves to allow you to do some projects? It also, again, might be useful to have zero-based budgeting, as we said earlier. So if it is a specific project over and above something you've ever done before, then you might need to build it up as its own little budget in there. And again, it's like doing kind of in a mini budget, really. So you're going to think about the income. How's that project going to be funded? So are you getting a grant or some money in from some source to be able to do that? Or are you going to use some of your budget or some of your surplus to put into the pot to do that? And then what's going to be an expenditure against it? So for everything, as it says there. So not only if, for example, we talk about installing a play park, there's going to be the core costs of the ground, preparing the land, the contract of the equipment that you're installing and sort of finishing it all off, but then those ongoing costs as well. So think about what's the impact on a maintenance budget, inspections budget going forward. How does that then impact the budget when we're thinking about it as well? And how does that fit in as well? And also, if you've got sort of ongoing projects, also be mindful of reviewing those budgets as well. So if you've got a project that maybe you're building up for over a number of years, it's also important that the budget process just to review those expected costs, because as cost rises seem to keep happening, is the amount that you're working to in that reserve still going to be able to cover the cost of the project that you're planning to do? And is there an impact if it isn't going to be enough as well? Okay, then, so now we've got lots of information. So we've got what we think we want to spend in terms of expenditure budget. We're aware if we've got any other income, what we think that might look like, and we've got given consideration to how about we want to manage our reserves and whether we think we've either got a deficit, a surplus, etc., that we might want to incorporate into our Precept calculation. Okay, so at the very basic level then, we can think about calculating the Precept as simply the expenditure that we want to make on our budget, less other income expected or prior year surplus and or potentially. So very simply, in our example there, if we had an expenditure budget that we've calculated of £100,000, we think we're going to get other income coming in of 20, we now require 80k. So that would be our Precept that we want to set potentially. So the very basic calculation there. Obviously, if you want to factor in some surplus that you might want to, potentially use up and how that fits in as well, then that might have an impact. But that's the very sort of simplistic calculation that you would start with. And it might be draft one that you do this initially and see how that looks. And then it might be, as we said at the start, that you need to go back and review and see how that fits in, particularly if it's looking like quite a significant change to maybe what you've had previously. Okay, do be mindful though that if your Precept looks like it needs to change significantly, you also want to check the calculation based on your Band D equivalent property. So that's the equivalent number of properties on Band D of the council tax, and you would divide your Precept out by the number that you have. Okay, you'd also wanted to do that last year to see how that compares. If you've had a significant change in the number of Band D properties year on year, so if there's been a lot of building work and you've got a lot more properties now, you're going to obviously have more Band D properties. So if the Precept's gone up because you're now providing more services because there are more homes there, it might have gone up, and on the face of it, it looks like quite a large rise of the Precept, but actually per Band D property, it might be fairly insignificant. Okay, so it's important to think about it in terms of that as well, particularly if the scope of what you're covering and the services you're providing have changed. If your Precept does come out as vastly different to last year as well, then you might want to think about how that affects and what you potentially want to do about it. So firstly, it's just making sure going back to that budget and just sense checking it. I'll do whatever the budget comes out as. I'd always recommend that you review it and get someone to look at it or go through it again. Make sure, you know, you haven't missed something, you haven't double counted something. It looks appropriate, okay, to make sure that that calculation is correct. But if it is, and then you're not comfortable with that precept level that you're going up to, is thinking about how can we mitigate that problem. So potentially we need to think about cost savings, okay. So I did this session last year when we were in the thick of it with Liz Truss being Prime Minister, and we had 10% inflation, we had the budget issues, and it was sort of causing real problems for where we were now. And I think I did another session sort of at the end of the following month when she then left, and the impact of that. So at that point, we were really sort of worried about where we were going to be, because the price rises were really hard sort of to deal with. We're kind of still in that a little bit, although it's plateaued, costs are still high. So it's important to think about, are there any elements where we can make cost savings? Do we need to defer projects or plan spend? Is it something that we now need to say that actually we can't do that now because we need to cover other cost rises, inflation issues that we've got are causing us problems, okay? Or can we reduce the amount we need to take in terms of the precept? So as I said, factor in if we're going to end up with a surplus, if we've got plenty in the general reserve, do we want to draw some down to put against it to allow us to have a lower precept, potentially if that's an issue? Or is the change justifiable and needed? It might be that actually the precept does need to go up. In sessions we've had previously, I've had quite a lot of people who come in and say, our councillors do not want to raise the precept. They see that as a real goal at keeping the precept at the same level. And that's all very well, but as costs go up, the services that you provide are going to be reduced, because if things cost more money, but you've not got any more money, you're not going to be able to do the same thing. So that's a real impact. And if you don't put it up for a number of years, it's going to come to a point where you have to, because at some point there's going to be a tipping point where suddenly we say we need to raise the precept. And I would say it's better to do small incremental rises than trying to keep it at the same level and then suddenly having to do a real big increase, because simply we can't keep up with the cost of living and the way the prices are rising. So that's another thing that I think we've had previously, where councillors are very stuck and think it's a positive thing not to increase the precept, but actually people will expect to see, you know, a rise in line with inflation and other costs, etc., going up, and other people may want you to spend more in their area. We had another example came on, I think it was last year, and they talked about their parish and they were putting more money. They'd increased the precept because they want to put more money into traffic control and speed awareness, and they were putting in a speed sign and doing some work in there. And the majority of the parish were really for this, and they were all comfortable with that precept rise, because actually to them the traffic problems in their area were so important, and the speed and what was going on with that, then actually they were happy with that. So it was that mindset of actually it's okay to do that if we're providing services that the parish wants, rather than just saying we're not going to put it up at all. Okay, obviously if you do find you need to, you're putting the precept up, maybe it wasn't enough previously, the services, as we said, the scope has changed, then it's just thinking about how we justify that, giving the information, working it out based on those bandy properties, maybe even working it back to the equivalent value of what it is a week, so we can start to think about the impact of that as well, so it can give more information about where that's coming from. I left this in, this was something I added in last year, as I said, when we were sort of the 10% inflation and counteracting the cost of living crisis, but I still think it's relevant now as well. In times of when we're budgeting, it's always important to think about, can we reduce how much our payment budget we think it needs to be, opportunities just to reduce some costs as well. So very briefly, some examples that we had last year were to reduce the consumption of energy. So can we, where the lighting works, can be automatic, so lights on all the time. If we light up properties, do we need to do that all the time? Office waste, so simply, can we just do less printing, less photocopying? Can we do it online rather than having to create big packs of information for councillors? Can they access it on their laptop, their iPad? Do we need to defer projects or plan spending? So potentially that's got more of an impact, because that's actually going to affect people if we don't do these projects, but are we at a point where we need to think about that? Can we review our contracts and our suppliers? Obviously that's potentially difficult because they're facing cost rises as well, but at least if we can get into fixed price deals and we know where we are, it gives us some certainty as we move forward. And maybe we can think about investing in technology. So that might just be software. Instead of having an accountant, can we deal with it having account software? Can we go to a different phone service? Things like that about reducing those costs. And if anyone's got anything that was miraculous they did and found really useful, then feel free to share that at the end, because I think it's important. As we're sort of still riding high, I checked this morning and inflation's at 6.7%. We're still riding fairly high, and it's important to think about how we might want to try and reduce some of those costs as well. Finally then, at a point now, if we go through that process, and as I said, it might be that you need to go through that process a few times, review, think about what we need to change, how it all fits together and the impact, and then getting to a point where we're happy with the precept that we end up with. We're then talking about monitoring the budget itself. So this is going forward. So this is once the new budget's in, this is thinking about it all the time. And what I said right at the start, it's important to think about the budget, be aware of it, budgets versus actuals. It's going to help us with under or overspend, but it also gives a feel of what our budget is based on, what our council does, the services it provides, how that fits in with the budget. To do that, obviously you need a good cash book. You need to be up to date with your data. You need to have that information in. You need to reconcile it to the bank to confirm its accuracy. And then you can provide useful information to your councillors. As I said, you can give them that forecast as well, because it starts to give a feel of what do we think this end of year is going to look like. And again, I just want to reiterate how important notes are as well. So as you go through the year, if things happen, note it down. When you then come to budget time, such as now, if you've got a list of things to think about, that's really, really useful. And equally, as you set the new budget for next year, if you're changing some of your budgets and they're based on some calculations, keep a record of that as well. It's very easy to come to the end of April, first council meeting of the new budget, and somebody says, well, why is this budget this figure? And no one can remember. But if you've got said, right, we based it on this, this, and this, is this value considering this and this, you've got that information. It's really useful. Just make sure you've got a record of it, so nobody can then start to question it or cause issues if you've got all that information about how those figures were arrived at. Okay. Finally, then, that's just a quick example again from Scribe. So if you put that information in, this is our summary report, you've got those budget figures in, you start to put those actuals in, that then allows you to monitor the variance, and then that's what you that useful financial information to allow your councillors and your council to make informed financial decisions, and is so important. There we go. That takes me to the end. Lots of information in there, but I'll stop sharing and I will hand back to John.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah. That was a lot of information you shared there. I'm not really, you're the numbers person. I'm not too much of a numbers person in terms of looking at those budget versus actual reports. I'm more of a visual person, and this is kind of what we're going to be releasing an update to Scribe on Monday, which gives a really good overview of your budget in a visual way. I mean, it gives you your high-level stats in terms of your real-time snapshot of the financial position of the parish or town council, your income, your expenditure, and the outstanding invoices, days since you last reconciled, and also your current bank balance. Then a high-level overview of your current budget left, along with your assets. And then also it's nice, to get the visual breakdown of your cost centers and cost codes here. You can switch between receipts and payments there. And then you can get an overview. So that is your total budget, and the dark blue is how much you spent, and you can get an overview. You can even get a warning here that you've exceeded it by £525 there, and then you get the total funds for breakdown for your council. And then if you change your budget and you're playing around with the budget, I'll go and change it here. I'll add 5,000 on the water there. Water suddenly got more expensive. Save that, and I go in, and then let's just see. Yeah, so as you can see, it's increased. So it is a real-time overview of your budget. If you want to get a demo on Scribe and get an overview of the dashboard, feel free to click on one of those links in there, or just say yes in the chat. Otherwise, we've also I shared a spreadsheet with you guys in the chat. If you go further up, do it again there. There's a free spreadsheet you can download if you're not using Scribe, if you want to do your budgeting. Finally, oh yeah, also if you want to sign up to if you want to join us on our Facebook groups, if you want any questions or anything on budgeting, as we've got the group there. We've also got quite a lot of, there's a chat related to it on all different topics there, so you're welcome to join that.